Hi everyone. I welcome you all today onto today's webinar on plain language summaries of publication, where we are now and where we are heading. Today's webinar is all about you, our audience, and while we have our panelists with their cameras and mic enabled, you can use the private chat option to talk to our panelists today. Please share your thoughts, comments, and questions with all of us today. I want to now introduce the panel that we have today. Beth and Gisu will bring in the sponsor perspective on plain language summaries of publications. Joe will bring in the publisher's perspective. Trishna will bring in the patient perspective, and I, Vidhi, will bring in the writer perspective. And I will now give a brief introduction to all of our panelists today. Beth is Director, Publications Management at Pfizer, and she's involved in development of publication plans in oncology and digital medicine. In her role, she's quite involved in reviewing plain language summaries of publications. She advises teams on publication policies, best practices, and industry trends. Welcome, Beth. Gisu
Hello, thank you.
Hi. Gisu D. Cortes is head of Advocacy and Strategic Relations, Global Medical Affairs, Oncology, Daiichi Sankyo. Kisu's role is to bring in patients' voice and build strong relationship with patient advocates and Daiichi Sankyo. By understanding patients' needs and their experiences, they can build more relevant clinical studies and address patient needs. Joe is co-founder and publishing director at Bucharest Publishing, plain language summary consultant at Future Science Group. In her previous role, she has spearheaded FSG's initiative on making plain language summaries peer reviewed standalone articles in their journals. Trishna is a recognized patient engagement consultant, health advocate, speaker, writer, and content creator, and she works with across the globe with industry and non-profit to embed patient voice throughout the healthcare and life sciences ecosystem. She's an experienced PLS reviewer, part of FSG's advisory board, and is quite involved in creating different PLS trainings and workshops. I, Vidhi Vashisht, Head of Plain Language Services at Crystallis, over the years have written many plain language documents, including PLSPs, and work with different sponsors in establishing the processes and establishing successful writing teams. So I welcome all the panelists today. And I also want to acknowledge from our panelists that we are quite excited to have you all here today. You represent all the different areas that we represent in the panel. We have both industry and academia representation in our audience. We have patient advocacy representation and all the different areas within the industry, be it publications, transparency, medical writing, health communication, patient centricity is represented in our audience. Um, Today's agenda that I want to share is divided into four main areas, and we'll continue to have a conversation in these areas with all of you today. And feel free to send in your questions because at the end of each section, I'll be taking audience questions. So the first topic that we want to cover is the purpose of PLSPs. Next one is audience and what are their expectations. Factors that should be considered while producing and disseminating PLSPs and the value of PLSPs. Moving on to the purpose of PLSPs. The first question that we want to tackle is a basic one. We want to understand what these documents are. And Joe, I know you have done a lot of work at FSG around it and would like to hear from you what these documents are and the different formats they come in. Joe, you're
Yeah, sorry. Yeah. Thanks, Vidya. Yeah, thanks for that. Thank you for inviting me to take part in this webinar today. So I'll be happy to sort of cover this slide. So as you can see on there, there's sort of three main ways that we can provide a plain language summary or a sort of PLS to accompany an article. And I shall just sort of go through each of them now, just to give a bit more of a perspective on each of these. So firstly, there's the plain language summary that is featured within an article. And these really should be considered for sort of all publications that people are doing. So these are sort of the short summaries that sort of reflect the summary of the original article itself. There should be sort of around 250 words and provide details of the article, putting some of it in context, that sort of thing as well. When they're published within a journal, they're sort of typically peer reviewed, and then they're sort of featured alongside the abstract, where they then can be sort of, if tagged correctly, can be sort of pulled through to PubMed, Medline, etc. So they can be sort of seen alongside the original article. The second option then is where you can provide a bit more detail, because the plain language summary is sort of published alongside the article as sort of supplementary material. So this could be in the form of an infographic, or maybe a video, or just a bit more text, just to give a bit more context to the plain language summary. And again, I mean, this differs per journal, but with FSG, these are peer reviewed, and because we can, FSG can sort of add supplementary material post publication, these then can be added post publication. So for instance, with FSG, you can sort of publish an article, say in January, and then maybe in June, you might consider adding the plain language summary as supplementary material, because that's just how the journals at FSG work as well. So then the third option as well, which is called the plain language summary of publication. And these are a standalone article that was sort of pioneered by FSG a couple of years ago. So these are really an in-depth summary of an article that has lots of graphics and visual to support the content. So they are published very much like a traditional sort of journal article. They're sort of, written by authors, they're submitted to the journal, they're peer reviewed, and then they undergo sort of revisions. They're sort of peer reviewed for their sort of plain language principles, though, rather than for the content that's being presented, because it's based on an original article, we know that content has already been vetted for scientific accuracy. We need the peer review for a standalone PLSP to be vetted for the plain language accuracy. So the article then, is revised and it's accepted in the journal. And by having it as a standalone article, the PLSP is assigned its own DOI, which means that it's discoverable in its own right. It can be found on PubMed. You can send it out to sort of patient organizations, and people can really have a really nice sort of in-depth summary of that original article. And they can either get a full understanding of the original article, or they can sort of use that as a basis to then go on and read the original article themselves. And so, I mean, there's those three different types, but I mean, there'll probably be, there's many more that are just to accompany articles as well. There's the abstract plain language summaries as well, but those are just sort of the three types that accompany sort of the main journal articles.
Thanks, Joe. That's quite helpful. And as you said, they can come in many different forms. We are seeing audio and video formats as well, as you briefly mentioned. And of course, I mean, writing PLSPs in addition to scientific articles is additional effort, is additional resources. So the question comes to my mind is, why are we even writing these, and why it all started? And I think to kickstart that conversation, I want to invite Trishna and talk a bit about how PLSPs are beneficial.
Thanks, Vidhi. And I have to apologise beforehand. I've been fending off a sore throat for a few days, so I might sound a little throaty. So I think PLSPs, you're right, they do take more time, they take effort, they take resources. So often the question is, well, why are we writing them? And I think it's really important to understand the landscape in which we're living now in terms of health information, in terms of patient communities. So we've really seen what we could describe as a democratization of information, primarily because of the internet. Patients are looking online for health information. They will find publications in a way that previously hadn't been available to them. particularly now that we have open access and so many scientific papers are now available for everyone and they're not behind a paywall. Now, I'm a big proponent of open access. I think it's great for improving accessibility of scientific information. But I also believe there needs to be guardrails, because it basically opens up the possibility of misinterpretation if people who are non-scientific, non-medical, if they're not fully understanding that information. And this is really where I feel plain language summaries really come into their own, because it provides that bridge so that readership can go beyond the scientific community. And so it makes scientific information much more appropriate for the readability levels of wider audiences. And we have to remember that whilst we often think of the audience of PLSs as primarily patients, it could be caregivers, it could be non-specialist healthcare professionals, it could be health journalists. We also have to remember that we're living in an age of shared decision-making now. A lot of healthcare models around the world are moving away from the paternalistic model of healthcare towards a shared decision-making model of healthcare. And that means that patients need to be informed in order to be able to have effective discussions with their healthcare professionals. There's lots of research out there to indicate that one of the most trusted sources of information for patients is their doctors. So if doctors are using PLSs as an aid in order to have these discussions, and these are documents that the patient themselves can find and take to a clinic appointment, for instance, then it really gives a sense of the way in which we're able to have a much more informed community and facilitate essentially better understanding, better conversations between healthcare professionals and patients. And I think the other thing that we also have to remember, and I'm sure it'll come up more than once, is GPP, the latest iteration of the Good Publication Practice, which was 2022, actively encourages PLS. And that's for a reason, is because we know that PLS can facilitate these better conversations. It can make for a more informed population for people who want to find out more about their health.
That's great. Thanks for that, Trishna. I completely agree. And some of the research that I have done around publications and how patients are using it, it was quite surprising to see that publication came quite high when people went online to find health information. Beth, I want to hear from you as well. What's your perspective on why these need to be written?
I think Trishna did such a great job of describing the different audiences and the people who can benefit from the plain language summaries. One other point I just wanted to raise is that the reason we need these plain language summaries is that the underlying content is written in such a complex manner. So even though the desire is to share the scientific understanding, the publications themselves tend to be written at a higher readability level and have a lot of acronyms and things like that. So that's just kind of, needing to convert that. I see it almost as a translation exercise to what Joe was saying. The content's there. It's just a matter of putting it in that everyday language that people can consume more easily to enhance their understanding.
I was also going to add that, to Beth's point, the health literacy may not be there. So this provides the context for patients to better understand how to speak to their physicians, as well as what does it mean to them.
And I don't think that point can be underestimated. The fact that just general literacy levels are much lower than what people expect them to be, but health literacy, it really is important, because there is so much which is often assumed by a healthcare professional and others, whereby they think that somebody, if they're going into a clinic appointment, will know what they're talking about, particularly at the time when you're newly diagnosed. And actually, it's like learning a whole new language. And plain language summaries can really facilitate that, I think, because like I said, it's that bridge, it's that sort of that translatable document from the very highly scientific medical jargon to plain language, everyday language that people use.
Definitely. I think the crux is that PLSPs give an accurate source of scientific information which can be digested in an easy format and quite quickly. So thanks for that. And I think one of the challenges that I find is finding them online. And um, I guess probably one of the things around it is they come with different names. So, Joe, do you want to talk about that a little bit in terms of how PLSPs are named online right now in different journals and how that impacts us?
Yeah, sure. Thanks. So there is quite a lot of variation in the terminology used. I mean, even FSG up until sort of earlier this year, we were calling sort of plain language summaries the lay summaries, and that's really not what they are intended to be for. They are not necessarily just for, as we've sort of spoken about, for the lay audience. They're for such a wide audience. I know that we've got a slide later on that sort of gives some of those sort of breakdown of some of the audience for PLSPs. So I think it's really important that we do sort of try and sort of iron out all the different terminology that is used. I think we should try and sort of really focus on the term plain language summaries. These are, summaries written in plain language that, describe an original article. And then there's the plain language summary of publications, which are just a bit more of an in-depth thing. And all others are sort of other ways to describe plain language summaries. But I think basically, as journals all need to bandy together and say, right, let's call these plain language summaries, end of. Almost like you have an abstract. Every publisher calls an abstract an abstract. So every publisher call a plain language summary a plain language summary, and it just makes it easier. It makes them really distinct from the lay summaries that that are part of the clinical trials. That's a completely different conversation. So I think that publishers need to come up with a consensus and go with it. Maybe FSG will start the revolution. Who knows?
Yeah, definitely. And I think that's definitely going to benefit all the audience out there for PLSPs, making it more easily accessible. And coming to Joe's point around how these are different from lay summaries or summaries of clinical trial results for layperson as it's written in EUCTR, we do want to talk a little bit about a similar type of summary for results that are often confused with PLSPs. And one of the main reasons is they are often called using same names as PLSs or lay summaries. But these clinical trial results summaries for lay persons as required under EUCTR are required for interventional clinical trials. And the main audience this is written for is the trial participants and the patients. So, of course, the content is driven by the CSR. And because they are of a specific type of interventional clinical trials, they are mostly aligned and thus can be driven by a consistent template with text supported by tables and graphs. Whereas when I think about PLSPs, they are written to improve, as we talked, accessibility of scientific publications. And they are at the moment recommendation by most journals that are supporting it. And of course, content is driven by the scientific manuscript, which can be of different types of research at different time points of that research study. So the content as well as the format can vary a lot depending on what's in the manuscript, as well as based on what journal requirements are. I want to move ahead and talk about one of the most important questions I always ask: who is my audience and what's their expectation? So I'll move back to Joe, and from publisher perspective, would like to understand from her who are the main audience for PLSPs.
Thanks. Yeah, I mean, we have talked on this, Trishna and sort of Beth did sort of speak about this. So it really is, the audience really is, anyone who wants to, get a really easy to understand overview of an article. And it could even be HCPs or those specialists themselves who just, they don't have the time to sort of, maybe read the full article. They just want the really short synopsis, or they just want to sort of digest the original article, perhaps with visuals. Everyone's a different learners. I love an infographics, which is why I love PLSPs, because they're very infographic style. So it could be that you just like to read, digest information in an infographic style. So that's why PLSPs help as well. I think the main point to put across, that we've touched on this earlier as well, is these really are, people say they're for patients. They're just not for patients exclusively. They do help patients, they help caregivers, but they're just really to help anyone understand that content, and it could be sort of, students or, who sort of, learning about that subject here. They could be really useful tools for them. FSG has a survey that it's running when every time it publishes a standalone PLSP in a journal, there's a survey that pops up and asks you just some various questions about, who the audience is, the PLS, where you're coming from, that sort of thing. And we are really seeing a really diverse audience who are sort of, coming to the PLSPs. So I think that, this whole slide just reflects that, patients are part of it, but not the primary audience.
Great. Thanks, Joe.
One point to add there before you go on, VD, was just Joe said it so well, but just from a sponsor perspective, we're very careful to make that clear that patients aren't the direct or sole audience, just because we don't, publications are scientific, and we need to make sure that both the publication and any PLSPs are non-promotional. So looking at it with that broad perspective, and that patients may find them, to Trishna's point, they're out there looking, but if doctors can use them with their patients, that's wonderful as well.
Great. I can already see a couple of questions coming up, which I'll ask after the next question we have, which is around what's the expectation of our audience. Now, we talked about that we have such a broad audience, that makes me a bit nervous, and I want to understand what it really means in terms of how should I be writing this document. So Trishna, do you want to give it a start? I know.
Yeah, sure. So I think, well, number one, and this sounds really obvious, that it does need to reflect the original article. I've actually reviewed PLSPs that haven't fully reflected the original article, so they've missed out key things from the original that for all intents and purposes, I had no idea why it'd been missed out. But the thing is that it has to be a reflection of what was in the manuscript. It can't just sort of add things in or take things out, it's absolutely key. I think you also need to remember the journal requirements as well. So follow the guidelines, but also remember, who are you targeting this at? I mean, Joe was talking about infographics, loving infographics. I love them too. I think it's something where you are able to put forward sometimes often complex information in a very simple and easy to understand way. We've talked about the different types of PLSs, and I think you also have to try and remember which type of PLS is the most suitable for what your purpose is. It needs to be fit for purpose. I'm not a fan of the 250-word PLSs, because I feel that often so much time and effort is put into trying to fit into the word count that it doesn't make it as understandable or as easy to read. So you also have to bear that in mind. And also use of appropriate language and the simple and engaging visuals. Now, with the language, this is really where having a good review process bears fruit, because it's very easy for people to forget when they're embedded in, like, for example, if you're a medical writer and you're embedded in that world, it's easy to forget what is understandable to a lay person. Sometimes there's this myth that shorter is better. That's not necessarily the case, because often you may have to explain things. So, for example, include glossaries. I love having how to says. So you've got the phonetic spellings, and even so with digital, you can even click on something and it will say it for you, so you can hear what it sounds like, because that also makes somebody feel like they're learning. So they're not going into, for example, a clinic appointment, if they're a patient, and saying something wrong or feeling uncomfortable, thinking, oh, am I saying this right? Appropriate language also includes things like so the plain language guidelines, so using the active voice, using short sentences, and things like that. There's lots of guidance out there. And then in terms of visuals, there can be a tendency sometimes to have what I call graphic overload, where everything becomes a graphic. You really have to think what is appropriate. If that graphic is going to aid in explanation and understanding, then that's great. Sometimes it doesn't. And there have been times when I've sent PLSs back after having reviewed them, and I said, this graphic isn't appropriate. It doesn't enhance understanding. It's not really serving a purpose. So I would say just be aware of that and try and look at things from the audience's point of view as well. But like I said, I think having a really good, robust review process can really help with achieving some of these things.
That's great, Trishna.
I was just going to add to Trishna's that if you have a patient group or patients actually reviewing it, is very important because you also understand what is relevant to them. So it's really important to have them included as part of the review cycle.
Definitely. And I love the point about everything having a purpose in the document as well, whether it's your language or the visuals. So a great summary on what those different key expectations are. I want to take a couple of questions before we move on to the next section. And the first question I want to ask is more to Beth and Gisu, because I think this is relevant more from sponsor perspective. So the PLSPs are written from a manuscript and they need to match the manuscript that they are being written for, whereas plain language summaries of clinical trial results for EUCTR are written from a CSR. So they have different sources, which means that there could be potential differences between the two. And it could also double the resources. So how that can be tackled and how can sponsors streamline the process of creating these two types of summaries?
I'll start, and Gisu, you can chime in. We definitely have. We at Pfizer, we have different groups writing those regulatory plain language summaries versus the publications. But the idea that you want to capitalize on resources. One thing that we like to do is have the PLSP writers reference the prior regulatory plain language summary, so that we're not, recreating the wheel, that if there's already plain language definitions or ways to state certain things, those can be capitalized on. It can be challenging to start the PLSP too early because of our requirement that it has to reflect the article. So when you've moved into a publication, you start to have author interpretation and selected figures and things like that, where usually at least you want to wait till at least you have a solid draft of the publication, if not have moved on to, having reviewer comments so it's closer to final.
Thanks, Beth. The only other item I was going to add was that we start very early with the authors to make sure that they realize there's going to be a publication made for patients. So that's the only difference, but we do look at both the regulatory one as well as the plain language center.
Yeah, definitely.
Can I just I just wanted to just butt in as well. I just wanted to say that when we've we have quite a lot of pre-submission inquiries about sort of publishing plain language summaries, and a couple of people have asked, can you publish the PLSP before the original manuscript? So, but the point of the PLSP is it's an acceptable secondary publication. So you have to have the original article published first. Then the PLSP is published because that then cites the original manuscript. If it was the other way round, the original manuscript would become the secondary publication. It would be so complicated. So you have to have the original manuscript published, then the PLSP. Whether it's the PLSP is published a day after the original manuscript or a few months, it doesn't matter, but they have to come in a sequence. So I just wanted to explain that as well.
No, that's a fair point. I think the perspective of it following the manuscript is quite important one. And Joe, there's one question that I want to ask you from the audience before we move to the next section. Is there a summary of journal requirements published for PLSPs, and are journals looking at harmonizing PLSP requirements? Do you want to take that one?
There's no harmony between publishers at the minute, I don't think. I know there's some publishers who accept plain language summaries are sort of trying to sort of standardize things, but there's so many different publishers, journals that don't accept PLS in the first place, that it's getting them on board with thinking that they do need to have plain language summaries. That's, you know, the biggest step. And then down the line, there will be some harmonization of, you know, how they're formatted, that sort of thing. But I think that's going to take a big learning process within publishers. You know, a lot of publishers still see their audience as, you know, your HCPs, the scientists as such, and they just don't think that there is an audience beyond that. So I think there's just a lot of education that needs to happen to try and realize that, you know, especially with open access, anyone reads an article these days. So it's just, yeah, there's a lot of education to do with publishers.
Yeah, and something that we can expect in future to happen more of. So with that, let's move on and talk about factors to be considered while producing and disseminating PLSPs. The first one we want to tackle, of course, if you are starting new, how do you, really get started? What resources are available to support this activity? So I want to bring in some sponsor perspective and ask this question to Beth and Gisu. When your teams have started producing these, what are the resources you have gone to, what you would recommend people on call today to refer?
So thanks, Vidhi. From Pfizer's perspective, we referenced a lot of materials in building our processes and built some of our own. So when we were piloting, we started with an initial pilot looking at Congress PLSs, driven by our oncology group. And we had an Envision agency at the time who was the primary developer of those. So we knew that they were developing some tools and resources around that. So I would reference those at the time. We fortunately have a Pfizer author on the GPP 2022 guidelines, Angela Sykes, who was instrumental in developing our policies. So there's definitely things that we agree with that have made their way into the GPP guidelines. And we're members of Open Pharma, who I know are doing a lot with discoverability around plain language summaries. So there's definitely a wealth of resources out there. And we also built some homegrown tools, as it were, to kind of pull the information together as we built our guidance.
For our organization, our publications team actually covers both lay summaries as well as their publication with the same rules. So it's really important to include the advocacy team, which is my team, early on, so we can provide our perspective through the patient advocacy community, as well as any other information that patients would find relevant. So very similar, we work with our publications team since it's grandfathered in to those.
Great.
And just to join in, their advocacy is an important point. Pfizer has a broader health literacy community of practice that's been immensely helpful. Publication plain language summaries aren't the only efforts to write things with health literacy in mind. And there's also been a tool developed that uses automated checks. So to check for kind of the primary things that get looked for in a plain language summary that people can run their Word files through and return results. That's very helpful as well.
That sounds great. And I think there's going to be more and more need of this harmonization because plain language is impacting a number of different areas and number of different documents that we are producing at the moment. And I know there's a related question that we tackle on our next slide, which is which journals accept PLSPs. Of course, when one's starting to understand where can I publish it is a big question. And maybe Joe, from your perspective, would you like to talk a bit more on it?
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, so there's a list of sort of publishers' journals there that do publish, PLS at the moment. That's not an exhaustive, as it says, not an exhaustive list. I think the main thing to consider is when you are, you're developing a publication, looking to submit it to a journal, check their guidelines, check if they can publish a plain language summary. If not, perhaps ask them, would they be willing to publish it? They might be able to, if nobody's ever asked it before, they might then, if somebody asked for the first time, they might then consider it, or they may have different ways in which they can publish the plain language summary. If not, they might recommend other ways that you can publish a plain language summary. That journal might have a fig share where they can put the plain language summary, or again, and if that's not possible, then FSG publishes these sort of standalone plain language summaries, which they can cover any journal anywhere, and so there's that option as well to make that plain language summary. So I think it's just, in an ideal world, you'd have the original article and then the plain language summary that's accessible, discoverable, alongside that publication. But we don't live in an ideal world, so it's not possible at the minute. So there are options around there. It's just I just always recommend you speak to your editor of the journal. They may have flexible options, they may not, but it's always best to have that conversation with them up front, and then you might, heaven forbid, you might reconsider the journal just because they don't have the option to publish the PLS. There's just there are other journals out there as such, so there are, there's lots of options available.
That's great.
And Jill, to your point, it's good to check more often, because sometimes they don't at certain point, and then at some later point they do start having the PLSPs.
Yeah, exactly. Lots of journals change their minds all the time. So I think, it's always best to, even if they've said no, as you said no previously, when it comes to submitting, check again. They might have changed, their perspective.
That's a great point, Gisu. I think with PLSPs being something that are really picking up the momentum right now, we are seeing a lot of changes, a lot of new journals accepting and recommending it upfront. And kind of a related question is the original manuscript cited in PLSPs? In case anyone is interested in more details, I can say that clearly, yes, they are. And for standalone PLSPs, original manuscripts are always cited in. There are a few other questions which I'm sure.
And I'm sorry, Viti, before you move on, in an ideal world, it would be a two-way linkage. So, when you're doing the PLSP after the publication, it's appropriate, easy enough, and required in our case to cite and link back to the original article. If the original article can point to the PLS, that obviously enhances discoverability, but isn't always possible depending on the publisher.
That's true. That's a great point, Beth. Thanks for adding that.
So just to go back to Beth's point, on PubMed, you can actually do that. You can have the original publication, and then at the bottom it says a comment on or something, and that links to the plain language summary, and then vice versa. But that's only available through PubMed. The standalone PLSPs always have to link to the original publication, because that's what's one of the factors that makes them an acceptable secondary publication, according to the ICMJE. But it's not necessarily the other way around then. The original links to the PLSP, but you can do that on PubMed.
Thanks for adding that. And I think something that we talked about and Gisu also brought up was, when you're writing these documents, involve patient representation, and Trishna also brought up this point, that what you think patients would know and understand versus asking them, it can be completely different thing. So why we have talked about why it's important a little bit, why it's important to involve patients in the PLSP process, but how does that look like in practice? So Trishna, I know you have done a lot of work around this. So do you want to make a start and talk about different ways to involve patients in the PLSP process?
Yeah, sure. So I think the two main ways is either as an author or as a reviewer. Vast majority of the time, it's usually as a reviewer. We are seeing more patient authors come through, so they can then be an author on the PLS as well. But I think whenever we're talking about patient involvement, and this actually goes across, different types of patient engagement, we have to remember that there are different types of patients, and not all will necessarily be suitable for the purpose in which you want to engage with them. So in the review process, for instance, in an ideal world, we would actually have 2 stages of what we call patient review. So you would have what I call the expert patient review, and I'll explain that in a minute, and then we will have the lay review. So when we talk about expert patient, it doesn't necessarily have to be a patient from that disease area. Essentially, that expert patient review you need to have patients who are experienced in PLS review, and people who have essentially enough scientific knowledge and understanding to be able to go back to the original manuscript and be able to compare it and say, actually, this would be of interest. Why has this not been included? Actually, we don't need this. And that's only possible if somebody has a good enough understanding of that original manuscript. And also somebody who has understanding around the guidelines around plain language. They have an understanding of the clinical research process and things like that. If you can only have one level of review, I would always say go for that expert level of review, because at the end of the day, you can't review what's not there. And in order to really make sure that it's a fit for purpose document that is going to be effective and useful for patients and the audiences, then you do really need to have that expert level of review. People often ask me, where can you find people in order to do that kind of a review? Well, things like webinars like this. I speak at events, I write about PLSs. You have patients who, as I mentioned, are increasingly authoring manuscripts. They would be suitable for reviews of PLSs. You have people speaking at conferences like ISMAP. You're really looking for those advocates, those expert advocates who, like I said, would be able to do that level of review. The other considerations are really around the patient engagement practices. So things like transparency, compensation, because patients should be compensated for their time if they're reviewing these kinds of documents, providing guidance. Some of those resources, which were on the previous slide, are fantastic in terms of providing guidance. And also timelines as well. All of this is really important to make sure that the review process and the patient involvement is as effective and as open as possible. You want patients to be having a good experience I love reviewing PLSs. It's one of my favorite things to do in all of the things that I'm doing. But that's also because the experiences that I've had guidance. I've worked with some really, really great organizations who really understand the value of good patient level reviews. So that's really what you need to be getting from that patient level review. I don't know if Gisu and Beth and Joe have got more to
Yeah, I was just going to add that it's really important to have an expert patient because they provide that higher level of knowledge. But it's also really important to have some of the regular, non-expert patients reviewing it, because you want to be able to actually have it available to a broad general audience. So their input will show you the things that may be missing that the expert didn't realize. So that I think both are important, but for different reasons.
And also, I just saw something.
And I'll add that.
Oh, sorry. I was just going to say I just saw something in the chat around compensation, asking whether it's in line with GPP. Yes, it is. And actually, the latest iteration of GPP actually brought this out as a particular point that patients can be compensated for their time on publications, and that includes PLS. So, and the review of PLS it's the same as it's part of the publication process, and GPP does say that patients can be compensated for their time.
That's great.
And our patient advocacy groups have been instrumental in helping to identify, patient advocacy reviewers. I will say it's probably not commonplace because of the engagement and the contracting issues, but it's definitely encouraged. And our medical communications vendors will have lay review built into their processes. And then I've been really appreciative of the publisher journal comments who are adding another level of review. So it's interesting. There's a bit of an art to putting things into plain language, and some of it's subjective. So while we may have a strict checklist, when the journal reviews come back, we need to be flexible and take in those comments.
Definitely some great discussion on the topic, and I agree. I think seeing a lot of training available for patient reviewers, people who are interested in reviewing these type of documents, are also available online freely now, which is a great step forward. And as an organization, if you're able to capture the feedbacks that you're receiving on PLSPs through patient authors as well as reviewers, you'll be able to see how that is evolving over time and how that impacts the final output. In the interest of time, I'll move to the next one, and that's a big one. What are some of the best practices for writing PLSPs? And I know there are so many different aspects, operationally and document related. So maybe I'll ask Gisu to make a start and talk a bit about it. From her perspective, what are the key best practices to consider?
Thank you, Vidhi. I have to tell you, since this is such a new practice for my organization, as well as for some of the patients, they don't know that it's there. It's really important to have a process in place and work with organizations that actually have done this before or can help you build a process that could be usable throughout, building these LSPs. There's also important to have some training internally as well as externally when you have folks who want to be included in the review process. So it's important to set the ground rules around what is expected of the reviewers as well as the authors, right, who are going to be re-reviewing the lay summary that has been written. And then it's really important to be consistent around the types of information that's shared, as well as what is expected from the patient community and the broader general population around things that are important. The content has to be very clear and written at a level that is understandable by the audience. That health literacy comes into it again. And it's really important to be easy to follow format, including some white spaces. It can't be, all words. The pictures actually do add a lot.
I think you actually brought up a really good point there, and I think it's something that people often forget, is that use of white space, and the way that a document looks is just as important as the content and the language that you're using. Because even if you're using simple language and you've got basically 5 pages of block text, that doesn't make it easy to process. So it's about remembering to balance the combination of the two.
And I'll add that, the training was very important. We built kind of a fairly standardized process that involved, building the workflows in our publication management system to support plain language summaries, defining fees with our medical communications partners, agency partners, so that we can very easily do these and not be negotiating pricing each time. They tend to be fairly templated at a high level, with the content in between different sections being where, that will be specific to the publication.
And actually part of the whole setting up the process, there was a question in the chat earlier around, should every single publication or manuscript have a PLS? And if not, is there a danger of cherry picking? Well, one way that you could overcome that is within the process that you're creating, have a patient publication steering committee. because they will be able to advise on which are the publications which for patients are potentially going to be the most useful. Then if you're getting that advice, you can't necessarily be accused of cherry picking if it's not possible to do a PLS for every single manuscript.
That's a great point, and thanks for tackling.
Yeah, we have recommendations about, thinking of the ones that are going to have the publications that will have the greatest relevancy to patients. So kind of if you have to choose, you would choose a, clinical trial or a patient-reported outcomes over maybe something that's more esoteric. But given the broad audience and utility of plain language summaries, all of them can benefit to some extent. But at this point, it isn't possible to do them, or at least to the same degree. I think that 250-word summary probably is possible in everything if people take it, and that is a one step. But the broader full summary of a publication does involve some choice in where you're going to devote resources.
I think it's also important to have the side effect management written in a way that patients and caregivers understand it. So although they're not done as much, but I think that would be an area that is worth looking at and having those classes of drugs and side effect management.
Great. Thanks for those comments and discussion. And I can see there are so many different areas, starting with planning, process, training, and then content management that involves. And we want to just spend a couple of more minutes talking about preparing PLSPs and thinking about the content and the design. I love what Beth said earlier, that it's writing PLSs are like bit of an art. I see it. I'm marrying science with art with PLSPs because I think from a writer's perspective, writing PLSPs is the first thing that I have to do is really understand the content I'm going to write about, understand it in and out, and then write it in my own words as if I would write it in a living room conversation. Then I start thinking about what's missing in the story and what do I need to add to complete that story. Followed by editing and revising that work and refining it to create that final output. And what you see on the slide here are some of the principles that you would follow, and others have already talked about it a little bit already, which are extremely helpful in giving tangible tips on what works in writing effective PLSPs. So moving on, what should be considered while disseminating PLSPs? A couple of things we have already talked about, like consistent terminology, indexing. But are there other topics that you want to talk about? I know we talked a little bit about open access as well. But yeah, mainly want to hand over to Beth and Gisu and talk a bit more about considerations for disseminating PLSPs.
I'll say the open access is very important to us. We do mandate it for our manuscript plain language summaries, whereas for the scientific publications, we certainly encourage it, but Pfizer does not currently have a requirement for open access, although we're trying to reach a very high extent. But it's a must for our plain language summaries because of the difficulties with discoverability that we know about. And we appreciate, publishers and groups that will, then take the plain language summaries and disseminate them further, because we know there's challenges. So probably the supplemental type to an article are one of the biggest challenges. We consider that standalone and follows the same process. If someone can link directly to that, which is typically possible on a journal page, you could share a direct link to that content, but it can be harder to find. So. And I have to say, some of the reviewer comments that have come back from Future Science Group have been simply to put plain language summary in the title. Seems like a very simple thing, but it doesn't always happen. So I think that's a great, just anything we can do to help people find them.
The only other thing I would add to Beth's comments is that we also help provide it to the advocacy groups that we work with so they can share them broader with the patients that need them most, or post them on their websites. So it's really important for it to be there, and more people share it broader than what we can do, right? So we want to make sure that it gets out there to whoever needs it most.
That's great. And I want to move on to talk a bit about what's the value of PLSPs, and I'll move towards Trishna and ask her inputs on what she thinks the value addition is.
So I think, I mean, we've spoken about this, I think, already to an extent. Essentially, this is about creating better informed patients who are more able to partake in shared decision making more effectively. It's about patient empowerment. Even with the other people who are in the audiences for PLSs, I think that empowerment piece, it goes for them as well. So caregivers, health journalists, for instance, I think it would make their work much easier. It would make their writing much better because they're able to more easily understand some of the research that's coming out. I was in a webinar or something like that the other day, and I heard that in order for healthcare professionals to stay up to date in their particular specialty, they have to read it was X number of manuscripts per day. It was a ridiculous number. And I was sat there thinking, well, actually something like a PLS would help them with that, because then it means that they're not having to read full manuscripts all the time. I think there is so much value. We've only really touched the surface of the amount of value that PLSs can have. And I would hope that as more publishers, as more sponsors get on board with PLSs, that the value will start to be seen even more. I would hope that also that there would be some research being done around, more research being done around PLS. I know that some has been done, and some of it was presented at some of the ISMAP meetings in the last few years. I think around what is the value that it actually brings, that could be really, really good for being able to basically say, because I think everyone here in this webinar today, who all of us speakers, we all believe in the value. It's about the people who potentially aren't on this webinar, who aren't on this call. We need to be getting over to them what the value is.
Yeah, definitely. And we are top of the hour. So we want to end today's webinar with this question on where we see the future of PLSPs. So Joe, I know you have worked on PLSPs much before than most of us had heard about them. So what are your thoughts? What future looks like?
God, that's an endless question, I think. I think, that as I've said, the main thing is just to get all the publishers on board, just to standardize that, even if it's making a standard for the abstract, the 250 word plain language summaries, get everyone on board with those, get all the publishers on board. So that's sort of step one. And then there's many more things that you can do. You can have more journals doing the sort of standalone PLSPs. There's a lot of work needs to be done to make these more discoverable. Patients don't necessarily know that these actually, these types of summaries exist in the first place. So these all need to be, there needs to be more awareness of these types of articles. And also they need to be sort of, Medline's not the place for plain language summaries to be found. There could be a central sort of like repository to sort of house all these different types of PLS, just to make that, a really good tool for anyone to try and find these sort of, the plain language summaries. There's just, and then there's different formats. This is just the start of the beginning. I think there's just so much that can be done. And even what would be ideal is if each article that's published has different layers of information. You have the technical article, you have the plain language summary, you have the digital content. That's an ideal scenario, but there's resource involved with that. These resources aren't endless, unfortunately.
And I'm working with a team that's developing a plain language publication right now. So fingers crossed that goes well. But just starting with the plain language principles from the outset. So there's so many possibilities. That layered approach that you speak to, Joe, I think is really the future. The cross linkages across all the content.
And I think there was an article that was published, like an opinion piece a few years ago. I can't remember, it was in BMJ or something. And the author sort of said, well, write your content in plain language first, then write the scientific manuscript. So, that sort of, ethos perhaps could be considered when people are, sort of starting their publications.
Those are some great thoughts and great points. I already feel excited of what this holds, because this is not just great thing to read, but also I think to write as well, to really think through about the research and what value that brings in. So thank you so much to all the panelists for joining in today and sharing your thoughts and insights. I think it was a great discussion. And thanks to all the viewers who were here today with us and asked a lot of questions. Hope we were able to answer your questions, and I'm sorry to those we couldn't because of time constraint. Before you leave today, we'll really appreciate if you can fill the short survey that will come on your screen at the end of the webinar, and give us feedback on what you liked and what we can do more of in future. And visit our website at crystallis.com. Thank you, everyone, and have a great rest of your day and evening. Bye.